So please join us for that next week. This week we have our own Katie Pekarek, and she's the Water Quality Extension Educator. Did her bachelor's here at UNL and her master's at North Carolina State. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Katie.
All right, Mark, you got me online? All right, cool. So apparently I'm a double-fisted water and caffeine holder today. We're going to be making sure everyone's awake. Thanks. I am Katie Pekarek. I am an extension educator in the School of Natural Resources. I work on water quality. I have 100% extension appointment. In my other portion of my background, I'm a biological and agricultural engineer, and I farm with my husband in Butler County. So between those two things, I am always at the interface of agricultural conservation and water quality. And one of the things that over the last decade plus that has been very prevalent in my role has been the role that nitrate plays in Nebraska, and so the role of nitrate in water quality. So today, we're going to spend a little bit of time on that topic. Basically, I'm kind of like the lead into next week's time with Britt Weiser, who's going to talk to you about the farmer side or the ag conservation side. Today, we're going to talk about the water quality side of what nitrate is in Nebraska. So we're going to take a look at three things. This is the very basics of nitrate in Nebraska. We're going to look at how we monitor water in Nebraska, both surface water and groundwater. We're going to look at a state of the state's water. So we're going to basically investigate what nitrate looks like, both surface and groundwater across the state to date. And then we're going to see how we are addressing nitrate concerns in Nebraska. So in Nebraska, this graphic is still a little dated, but it gives a good picture of what's going on. We basically manage for water in 4 different aspects. We divide it into surface water and groundwater. We divide it into water quality and water quantity. So on the left side of the graphic, you can see that most of the water quantity issues are taken care of and managed through the Department of Natural Resources. On the right-hand side, the DEQ, which is the former Department of Environmental Quality, has combined with HHS, the former Health and Human Services, and they make up one entity now called the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy. And between those entities, that's where most of the water quality monitoring happens. We do throw in the Nebraska Department of Ag as far as it relates to pesticides, and then very intricately woven in here are also the NRDs throughout the state, which are local management systems, and the Nebraska Game and Parks. So there are a lot of hands that are involved in the management of water quality, which also translates into there are a lot of hands that are involved in how we monitor for water quality across the state. So taking a look at surface water quality, there are 3 basic ways that we're looking at monitoring for water quality. We do ambient stream monitoring, meaning that we're looking for specific contaminants in 100 sites across the state in May through September. We do lake monitoring, and we also do something called public beach monitoring, which that number of 51 kind of ebbs and flows a little bit. A couple of these sites are probably getting taken off this year. But basically in those cases, for the beach monitoring, we are only monitoring for 2 things, microcystin and E. coli. And in that case, we're basically watching levels to see if it's safe for public health, if it's safe for that primary contact. In addition to those primary sets of monitoring for streams and lakes across the state, we do something called basin rotation monitoring. And Albert's actually going to give a presentation at a national conference next week completely about our strategic monitoring in the state of Nebraska. But what this does is basin monitoring basically goes through these 6 different areas of the state once a year, and it allows all the entities to kind of figure out what are the priorities for monitoring. So there's initially an internal discussion amongst the monitoring agencies, and then a little bit of external contribution. So if we had a stream, we had a Shell Creek stream that was in the Lower Platte district, and in 2021, we were expecting that the quality of that stream was actually improving. So we did some additional monitoring there so that we could assess whether that quality was improving. Likewise, if we think there's a place where we might have an impairment, we might have an emerging contaminant, those adjustments can be made. And it kind of gives some flexibility to the strategy of monitoring surface water in Nebraska. So all of that water quality data is wrapped into one package. It's called our integrated report. And what it does is that it integrates a lakes and a streams report and tells us what the water quality looks like all across the state. So what it looks like in this map, all of the streams and lakes are assessed to have a certain goal. So there's a certain use that a lake or a stream is meant to have. So it might be primary contact, meaning you're swimming, you're boating. It could be agricultural uses, whatever the use is. Then it's that use is assigned certain contaminant or parameters that meet it. So on this map, anything in red, streams or lakes, anything in red is an impaired stream, meaning that it does not meet its intended use. Anything in green is supporting, meaning that it does meet that intended use. And all of the blue all across the state is the things that we don't have enough data to make an assessment. So we may have sampled there, we may have sampled never there, but we don't have enough to make a statistical assessment of what that looks like. So in Nebraska, we do not have nutrient standards for streams. That's a caveat to what you see across here on the most common impairments. Most commonly in lakes, nutrients are going to be the #1 impairment. And most commonly in streams, we're going to see bacteria, aquatic community, which typically relates somehow back to erosion, whether it's in stream or in the watershed, and then atrazine. So that's surface water in a nutshell. This does not mean that we do not find nitrate specifically or any other nutrients in our streams. It just means that we're not monitoring for it in a way that would cause us to impair or assess a stream for nutrients. Groundwater quality actually gets a little bit more complicated. So all of these entities you see are actually monitoring water quality in some way, shape, or form. What's tricky about this is that they're monitoring for possibly different goals. So like the 23 NRDs that are all across the state, they're monitoring for things that might be within their management control. So they're probably monitoring for nitrate in groundwater, and they're probably monitoring for agrochemicals. On the other hand, someone like the public water suppliers, they have a much broader list, a much longer list of parameters they are monitoring for, but they're not necessarily monitoring for those agrochemicals unless they are on their regulated list. So understanding that, basically in 1996, the legislature followed suit when the NDEE, the NRDs, HHS, and the university got together and basically said, hey, we need a way to have a repository for all that data. And what that resulted in is our agrochemical database. It's a quality assessed database, and it's actually housed right here in SNR. So it's something that provides a lot of value to people that might be wanting to mine or use that data or find conjectures within that data. So it is now, as of 2021, all available online. So if you wanted to go in and download the data from all of the samples since 1974 that have been collected across the state, you can do that. Those are quality assessed, and they're in there through, I think, 2019. Colleen Steele is managing it and does a lot of work on that. So there's a lot of things in play that will mean that we'll have the last 3 years worth of data quickly uploaded and coming into play. But it is all publicly available, so we can actually download this. What is not publicly available is our public water supply data for safety reasons, but it's very simple to get a hold of that. So if it's something that might play in or help to your research, it's simply a call to the Department of Environment and Energy. So all that data is coming from lots of different wells across the state. We have something like 185,000 samples that have gone into this agrochemical database. That number has climbed since I've pulled this number. Those numbers are from the 2020 report. And so all across the state, you can see that the green's the irrigation wells. That is the primary source of groundwater data that we are providing. So if you think about irrigation wells, We're talking about agricultural scenarios for that sampling. We're probably most often sampling in an NRD system, and we're also targeting what we're sampling based on what they can monitor. So that all influences what kind of data goes into this, goes into the agrochemical database. The other things that we see actually quite a few samples for are domestic wells and livestock wells, with domestic wells having something like 35,000 samples that have been input into the agrochemical database. Now, again, it's data, right? It gets really tricky. It wasn't until 1996 that 1993 that we started registering our livestock and our irrigation and our domestic wells. That's when we started registration in September of 93. So what that means is that there are 35,000 active wells registered in the state. And the estimate that we have is that we have 150,000 domestic wells. So those are private wells that people are drinking from. Those wells are not regulated. They don't have to sample. They are responsible for their own water quality and their quantity and their own safety. So that all goes back to the individuals owning those domestic wells. As opposed to public water supply wells, where all of the wells are sampled, as well as the actual point of distribution to the consumer. So if you're getting water from a public water supply, you know that you are meeting drinking water standards, versus if you're in a domestic well, we've only got 23% of those that are registered, give or take, and we know that we're not sampling all of those, and we know that if we've got 35,000 samples in the clearinghouse, that we're not sampling those every year, every 5 years. We're lucky if we're getting samples every decade. So that's the big sweep of how we are monitoring surface and groundwater across the state. Looking into the results of what does it say in that ag chemical database? What do we see in our groundwater? This is a chart that comes out of our groundwater report that's put out by the state of Nebraska. And in this, we have sampled for 241 contaminants since 1974. And of those 241 contaminants, only 12 of them, these 12, show up 50 times or more in that period of time. And when I say show up, this is above the reporting limit, meaning that it's above a detectable limit. This is not above an MCL, this is detectable. So what you can see is that out of all of the chemicals and things we have in our groundwater, we see nitrate in our groundwater 90%, 91% of the time. All this to be said, the really important number here is when we come back to what is the limit, what is the safe drinking water limit for nitrate? And in this case, it's 10 parts per million or 10 milligrams per liter. Interestingly, when you take a sample of water and you take it to a laboratory, they're going to give you back that report number, and sometimes it comes back in parts per billion, sometimes parts per million, and sometimes milligram per liter. It's something that actually causes a fair amount of confusion amongst domestic well owners that are sampling their wells. And also interestingly is that if you were to take a soil sample agronomically, so say you're a farmer and you take a soil sample, they actually give you a residual nitrate number that often gets confused for the amount of nitrate that's in your water. So that is a number that contributes to how farmers make decisions on how much nitrogen to apply. And so creating some more clarity around that is one of the things that a lot of our collaborators throughout the state have spent a fair amount of time working on over the last several years. Now, we know that the MCL, we know that we're looking at 10 parts per million for nitrate as a safe standard. And we know that we see some higher nitrate concentrations coming through our groundwater, which is our primary drinking water supply in Nebraska. So why is that? Basically what we have is we have a highly vulnerable area. This chart is actually the vulnerability of our groundwater aquifers, specifically to nitrate. And you can see we're actually not in a exceptionally vulnerable area. We're not in the high reds. But if you go from the big map of the US where it overlays on Nebraska into this map, what you'll see is that these colored blocks are the median nitrate concentration for each township across the state. It might be hard to read those numbers there, but anything in orange is 7.5 parts per million or higher. Orange, red, purple, all of those have the higher concentrations. And so what you'll see is that those track fairly closely to where we have high vulnerabilities for our aquifers. What are those vulnerable things? What makes the aquifers vulnerable? It's all things that make a lot of common sense, right? Highly sandy soils are going to allow for more infiltration, more water movement. Nitrate is highly mobile. So when we have things like, it's water soluble. So when we have things like high amounts of irrigation, it picks up the nitrate, it can move it down past the root zone and it can leach into the groundwater where it's no longer a valuable commodity to the crop, but rather a potential detriment. Shallow water tables also make us more vulnerable because it takes less time to move through a sandy system with a shallow depth to the groundwater table. And a thin vadose zone is another thing that contributes to some of our groundwater risk factors. And basically what the vadose zone is it's that distance between the bottom of the root zone and the top of the groundwater. So once the water passes the root zone of your plants, that middle ground before it gets to the groundwater, that is considered the vadose zone. So I want to take a look at this picture because this has been used for several years. This is the median concentration of nitrate all across the entire state. The dots are the concentrations. The black is a trend line. This is from 2000 to 2020, and the maroon bar is how many samples were taken. So if you looked at this, you might say that over the last 20 years, the state of Nebraska has an increasing nitrate concentration. If I pulled for you the data that goes further back, if I added another 20 years to this data, that change in concentration would look even steeper. That trend line would be changing at a much faster rate. It'd be a very different picture. But I want you to think about where we're getting our samples from the state. The fuzzy yellow in the background is because I am not a GIS master and I need someone else to fix this map for me. But what you're seeing here, I gotta give you a range here. The orange, purple, and magenta dots, orange, magenta, purple dots are 7.5 parts per million and up. And you'll see that most of those are coming along the Platte River corridor. We have some along in the east and south, and then we've got some in the northeast part of the state as well. If I take those same dots, those same concentrations, and I show you that median concentration by township over a 20-year period, you'll see that the pattern is pretty much the same. Now that's 18,000 wells, 18,000 samples over a 20-year period. We do not sample every well every year. In fact, we often don't return to a well. We may have a well that's sampled 3 times over a 40-year period. So to build trends off of that gets very difficult and very complex, and it's very nuanced. So all I'm saying is that we have lots of nitrate concentration for the state. We have lots of data, huge amounts of data in the Ag Chemical Clearinghouse, but we have a very nuanced and finesse set of data that needs to be worked with. So what I did is I took that data and I put it into 10-year increments, and I'm just showing you nitrate concentrations. And again, the scale changed here, so I'm sorry, but anything in green is less than that 7.5 parts per million. Anything colored is higher than that. So if you look in the 70s, you can see we did really a lot of quadrant style samplings along the western part of the state, and we had some fairly regular samples in the east. If we move forward to the next 10 decades, you can see that sample distribution really changed fairly significantly. And I'm going to go back to the 70s just for a second. If I go back to the 70s, you can see we already have those high nitrate concentrations showing up along that Platte River corridor and up in the northeast. Back into the 80s, the distribution changes. In the 90s, we get more samples, the distribution changes, we find a few more places where we're having concentrations above 7.5 parts per million, but seem to focus just on expanding those primary spots we saw in the 1970s. We hit into the first decade of 2000. Again, it's very similar to the 90s. And then we come into the current sampling. So what you can see, again, is that the concentrations are, they may be changing, and we may have these statewide concentrations of change, but it's really this local management and local sampling that is going to provide the most power in the data that we have for the state. So to follow up on that, this idea of local water concentration, it's like politics. All politics are local, all water is local, right? It really matters if it's in my backyard. So one of the things that Dan Snow out of the Water Center is doing is VADOS sampling across the state, and he's been doing this for several years. But this is just one example out of the Hastings Wellhead Protection Area. In the Hastings Wellhead Protection Area, they're sampling from, again, the bottom of the root zone down to the water table, and they're getting a poor water concentration of nitrate as nitrogen. One of the things that we like to say is that, or that we've sometimes heard, is that nitrate is a legacy issue in the state of Nebraska. If that's the case, we like to suggest that the nitrate concentrations would get less and less as we get to the modern day, right? So I can't tell you how long ago this sample is from. I don't have the age dating on this. But what I can tell you is that this is going to be the oldest sample that was taken. And we're looking at, say, 35 parts per million, 35 in concentration. And there's definitely a decrease in the poor water concentration as we get into newer samples. So say this is 40 years ago and this is 30 years ago. There's definitely a decrease of concentration, meaning there's a decrease in loading or something else is happening within that soil profile. But what we also say is that it's not consistent, right? It does jig-jag back and forth, for lack of a better term. But we have different sets of loading and different characteristics that are happening as we push nitrate into our soil profile. 520 pounds of nitrate is how much is in this 20-foot profile. If I'm going to roughly raise a 300 bushel yield of corn, which would be a really high irrigated corn yield in the state of Nebraska, somewhere in the nature of 250 pounds would raise that 1 year's crop. So there's a lot of nitrogen sitting in this profile that might have some value for us. Okay, so this to me, this is the fun part. In Nebraska, we actually have a lot of agencies, federal, state, university, and commodity and local regulatory partners that are very interested in addressing what we see as high nitrate concentrations throughout the state. And so there are lots of implications from having high nitrate concentrations in Nebraska. But the big thing that we have going for us in Nebraska is we have a lot of collaborators that are willing and interested in working together. So there's lots of good stuff in here. The first place we look at how we're addressing nitrates in Nebraska is public water supplies. They are required to address nitrate in Nebraska, right? So if you look at this map, this is the systems that we have across the state. Anything you see that has a star, a pink thing, or a red thing, it is a public water supply that is sampling for nitrate on a regular basis because they have seen some sort of high concentration in their system. We have approximately 20% of our public water supplies that are sampling for this. They're also sampling for a huge suite of other contaminants. So this is one small portion of what they're sampling for. And I have to put in here that a lot of the communities that have public water supplies, it could be someone that has 25 hookups. So these are not necessarily City of Lincoln, City of Hastings, City of Omaha. We have a little town of 200 people, and our rural water operators are really the ones that are at the forefront of how we address these public water supplies. So what do we do when these communities, maybe a 200-person community, has a high concentration of nitrate in their water? The first thing we look at is, do you have one well that's got low nitrate concentrations? Do you have one well that has high nitrate concentrations? If you have that combination, can you blend water from the two wells to get below that 10 parts per million? Another thing we look at is the potential of drilling a new well. But when we get into small communities and costs, that does not always pan out for the community. Third option is treatment, right? RO system here, we see those across the state, just a few of them. But what we see is that we have a lot of costs associated with that, and evaluating those trade-offs there are always very important. And then one of the things we see some of the smaller systems, especially in the northeast part of the state doing, is we see them hooking into other water systems. So at the point that something catastrophic happens to their public water supply. So it could be that they no longer have a nitrate concentration that's within regulatory standards, but it could also be any number of things such as a well failure or contamination, whatever it is. Rather than drilling a new well or fixing an existing system, a lot of them may choose to hook into another rural water supplier, which can provide for new water systems, but it also can sometimes work out to be more cost effective to pump water 9 miles from another town rather than pumping or creating a new well. Now, private wells, we kind of touched on this. Private wells are not regulated, right? All public water supplies are regulated and have to report into their water. You can actually get that water data. They have published it in newspapers for years and years. Now they've started to put it online. But for private wells, every individual homeowner or domestic well owner is responsible for sampling their own water quality. We know that we have 35,000-ish wells that are registered in the state and about 150,000 total wells. So we do not have a good handle on what domestic water users are drinking. For those users, when they do get a high nitrate concentration, they have a couple of different options. One is household treatment, one is point of use treatment. Very rarely do they have the option of hooking into another supply. And drilling a well is drilling a new well is not often an option because they're typically working with a smaller space of land and often going into the same water supply, even if they could drill a new well. So moving away from the domestic water supplies, one of the things we do in the state is we have something called wellhead protection areas. If you follow this QR code, you can actually go in and see all of the wellhead protection area boundaries across the entire state. Basically what a wellhead protection area is, I have the city of York up here, but the wellhead protection areas basically map a 50-year time of travel. So if this is my well, the red line shows me that water at this point will take 50 years to get into this well. They do that for all the wells in their well field, and then they draw a boundary around those well fields. York is kind of entertaining to me because we have a significant amount of their well field up north, and then we've got a new, well, it's not new, but we've got another well to the south that provides an emergency line. So it looks very interesting. But within these wellhead protection areas, effectively what the communities are able to do is they're typically working with voluntary programs. They sometimes are able to work with drinking water protection plans. So they can go through the state, they can put together a plan, and they can then apply for some funds to help them do things on the ground. But these are all completely voluntary. The areas are all drawn, but actions in those areas are 100% voluntary. So more local water management. The NRDs across the state, there's 23 districts across the state that are managing water with a board So each one of these NRDs has an elected board. Several of these NRDs have 20+ board members. Primarily, these are going to be farmers and community members. We get a little bit of a different makeup when we get into the Papillon, Missouri and the Lower Platte South, because those have a little bit of urban districts, thinking Lincoln and Omaha and those two NRDs. So each of those boards is helping to make those local management decisions for how water is managed. What this translates to, it has been called phased areas for water quality management in the NRDs. So if you ever hear anyone say phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you'll have an idea of what they're talking about. But effectively what happens across the state is most NRDs have 1 or 2 phased areas. They might have a third, and there's a lot of talk about adding a 4th. So each NRD sets a different trigger point, meaning that a phase 1 area might have a nitrate concentration of 0 to 5 parts per million in one part of the state. A phase 1 area might be an entire NRD in another district, and a phase 1 area could be 0 to 10 parts per million or 0 to 9 parts per million. It just depends on the NRD. And then based on what they set as their trigger points, they all set their own management actions. Some of those actions are like mandatory educational classes. There's a lot of NRDs that have no fall fertilizer in some of the higher phases of the phases. And then things like crop reporting or soil and water sampling, those could become mandatory at that point. So I'm just going to give you 2 examples here. One is in the northeast part of the state, which is Brazil, but first I'm actually going to do the bigger, broader one down here, which is the Central Platte NRD. The Central Platte NRD is one of our success stories across the state. So this is one that we want to say, yes, we've made improvements. Things have gone better in the Central Platte NRD. They were actually one of the first groundwater management areas in Nebraska, and they were one of the first areas of the country to have regulatory actions based on groundwater quality. So they've got these 3 different phase levels. You can see in this case, there's 7.5 keeps them in a phase 1. Less than 15 keeps them in phase 2. And then they've got a phase 3 and a phase 4. And the phase 4 is actually pretty subjective in that if the NRD is not happy with how fast the nitrate concentrations decline, they can designate an area to be in a phase 4. So what this means, in 1987, the nitrate concentrations across the district on average were about 19. In 2017, those got down to 13.3. So across this 90, across a 30-year time span, the concentrations dropped 6 parts per million, completely based on voluntary actions. So this is absolutely fabulous. We've got decreases in nitrate concentrations, all based on voluntary actions. Yes, there was financial support for these actions, but nothing was primarily that was not regulated. There were a few regulatory actions, changing the timing of when nitrogen was allowed to be put out, and also changing what kind of educational requirements were placed on. But primarily, this is based on voluntary actions. The unfortunate thing is that this is still above that 10 parts per million, right? And it is also took us 30 years to get that 6 parts per million decrease. So this is it's enlightening, right? It tells us that in these systems like the Central Platte, where we have some sandy soils, we have some shallow depth groundwater, and we have relatively low starting nitrate concentrations, I'm going to call 19 low in the case of Nebraska, we can make some significant improvements. Now, if we decrease our nitrate concentrations by 6 parts per million, but we started at 50, this may not be the same kind of success story. So the other case study here that I want to show you is the Brazil groundwater management area. And this is an area that we've been working with as a university since the 1980s. We actually had a couple of fabulous researchers here, the Spaldings, that did a lot of research and a lot of data collection at the time. We've done a lot of reports, and we're very intertwined with this area as a school. So basically, the part that I'm showing you this time, though, is what began in 2016. And they actually put into place a groundwater management area, the BGMA. But the groundwater management area basically has two different trigger wells, two different triggers. It's got a phase 2 and a phase 3. And you can see on the right all the things that they did in these different areas. But the tricky thing about this is, remember those NRDs have 20, call it 20 board members on each of these boards. This area here that has this really high nitrate concentration has 4 different NRDs on here. So there's 4 different NRDs working together. Internally, that's a major step forward. They're also working with a lot of entities outside to accomplish a lot of on-the-ground practices to improve nitrate concentrations in the groundwater. So, moving from a local scale into a little bit broader scale, one of the things that Brazil has in place is a national water quality initiative area. Britt Weiser will talk about NRCS programs that help farmers next week. But basically what this does is it makes it less competitive and more easy for the people in the Brazil area to get money to support practices to improve water quality, rather than having to compete with other people all across the state. So that's one of the things that's influenced having more money going into the area, but also had created an easier pathway, removed barriers for farmers to apply practices. They've also taken some regulatory actions. They've put in some voluntary BMPs, and there's a lot of cost sharing in the area. So they're working very closely with NRCS to get farmers signed up, and hiring lots of people to make sure that things get on the ground in a fairly small area. More locally and more recently, the Lower Platte South NRD here in Lincoln has hired a source water protection focused person. And so in this case, they're calling it a drinking water protection specialist. But what this person does is works with the farmers and the communities to connect wellhead protection plans. So they're working only with drinking water areas that are influenced for public water supplies, but works with farmers in those areas to apply BMPs and get them tied into the wellhead protection plans. This, at this stage, is actually sponsored by the Lower Platte South NRD and the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy. But moving forward in negotiations, the NRCS is actually going to be working with this model as a model for the rest of the state and work with additional NRDs to create these positions all across the state. So effectively, the NRDs, the state, and the NRCS have recognized that we need to focus on source water protection, or protecting the drinking water of our public water supplies, and are looking at working with the farmers in each of those wellhead areas to help make that happen. There's lots of local and state as well as federal grants that are available and being worked with across the state. Some of those come in the form of a state revolving fund. There's a few holdover that come in a Nebraska Environmental Trust, but we have lots of agencies, Farm Bureau, Corn Board, et cetera, that are also putting money into trying to address nitrate issues by doing on-the-ground management practices. At a state level, half of the time I spend with the university is as a liaison with the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy in their 319 program, which basically means I work with their nonpoint source people. And one of the things that we do in Nebraska and across the nation is develop these watershed management plans. And these are all water quality based management plans. So it goes back to that first map I showed you with the red and the green streams and the red dots and the green dots and the blue dots. And basically using those as a map, the NRDs work with the state to develop priority areas where they're going to work. And again, most of the time, these plans are directed towards getting some on-the-ground practices across an entire watershed so we can see improvements in a surface water body. But there are some instances, like in this Brazil area up here, and then each one of these stars where they're working with groundwater as the specific target. So it's a recognizing that our non-point source pollution, the things that we have on the ground, also influence what's happening below the surface. I throw this one up here. This is a current program that we have going through the state. What I want to point out here is that as a legislature, we actually have a lot of interest in our state legislature in doing positive work towards water quality improvements across the state. And nitrate has been one of those focus areas for the last couple of years. In the 2021 session, there was a bill that passed that basically said, if you sample your water, your domestic well water, and you have high nitrate concentrations, the state will pay for a reverse osmosis system. It's a reimbursement program, but there is no cost to the homeowner. So that is an ongoing program that's going throughout the state. Last year, there were several bills that were introduced to do similar things to address nitrate in domestic well users. They didn't get to debate last year. They didn't make it into conversation, but they were proposed, which was a lot of interest within the legislature again. And then in this week's legislative education session, and I apologize for the turn of phrase there, but in that session, we actually had our water center, Dan Snow and Jesse Bell, who is our water, climate, and health director at UNMC. Both of them spoke broadly about water quality, but also specifically about water quality and health, and specifically about nitrate. So it's something that is being recognized as an issue that we can take some action on at all of these different levels, at state, at federal, education, and again in our state legislature. I'm just throwing this one out here because in 2020, the university led some nitrate working groups that had the heads of several of these agencies, lots of collaboration. There were 54 different entities that were represented, and there were a total of 83 different people that participated in these working groups. And they actually completed a needs assessment, which came out with 3 priorities to address nitrate in Nebraska. In 2018, at a federal level, we had the 2018 Farm Bill basically designated that 10% of our conservation funds have to be directed towards source water protection in Nebraska, so drinking water protection, and that applies in every state across the country. So what we did in this case is we actually created a subcommittee of the NRCS State Technical Committee, because the NRCS is the one that's going to apply that 10% conservation practice. And so that subcommittee prioritized how we would direct those source water protection funds across the state. So you'll see here that all of these red dots, those are those wellhead protection areas that I showed you, or that I gave you that link to. So that's the primary place that these 10% set aside funds are being directed. We additionally have the orange is the phase 2 and phase 3 areas across Nebraska. So that's based on the NRD management approaches. And then the hashed areas are the groundwater quantity management areas. So this plan is source water protection, quality or quantity. This comes back to that NWQI, that National Water Quality Initiative. Again, we have several of those in the state that are either active, in the process of becoming active again, and a new one that's been proposed. Again, what these do is they bring in this extra federal money to put practices on the ground that's not competitive with the rest of the state or the rest of the country. So it's an influx of support to help put practices on the ground. And there's a lot of information about nitrate. What I didn't touch into this week was the health component going along with that. Jesse did do a full seminar on water and health about 2 weeks ago. So if you want to go back and catch that recording here from the SNR seminar, that is available for you. But that's really the driver, that the nitrate and health, the water quality and health, that is really the driver for why we make these practice changes. That's the reason why we have management changes. And that's the reason why we continue to pursue a lot of this data. There's a lot of things coming for Nebraska's efforts. I think we've got a water quality swing going on in the state, where we're going to have some focus by several entities on not only nitrate, but other water quality issues for the state. And I think one of the places that we'll be able to do that is we'll be able to promote the value of Nebraska's water, really focusing on reducing some of the misconceptions that go along with it. So I'm going to leave you with these parting thoughts. I don't have to read those for you, but I think there's a lot to be done in the world of nitrate. There's also a lot to be learned from the things that have been done, both departmentally and outside of the department. So this is your broad overview. There's a lot more out there. So with that, we can do questions. Do we need to use the mic, John? All right. I'll give it to you. Yep. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. I'm going to be that annoying person that asks a question about something you didn't talk about.
Yeah.
But I just want, so this is all about chemicals in our groundwater. And then there's all kind, like, so there's toxic algae type biotic stuff too. Is it just from, I'm just interested in your perspective, is that in the kind of rankings of public interest in those two different water quality areas, if they're like a little horse race running along, is one still way out in front of the other? Is one catching up? What's the relationship in terms of public interest between the two?
I think there's an ebb and flow of which one is probably has more attention from our broader entities across Nebraska, whether it's surface or groundwater. To take a comparison of 10,000 lakes, right, where you've got drinking water, if you've got drinking water sources that are surface water, if you have lots of lakes that are primary recreation sources, I think the toxic algae blooms, the HABs, those really take center stage and priority. In the case of Nebraska, I think that the trend right now is that the center stage is on public health, which is why someone like Jessie Bell and the Water Climate Health Program is very essential. But when we make that switch into the public health frame of mind, that really influences that a lot of efforts need to be directed towards groundwater.
Hi, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
My question is motivated in part by the recent articles on our governor. And it makes me wonder, what, in your view, to what extent are the problems we have due to a few bad actors, like big point source polluters? And to what extent is it really more of a diffuse, everybody's doing it at some low level, and because these have to me, in my mind, different solutions or different challenges. And then related to that is our somewhat voluntary approach to doing this stuff working? Are people generally cooperative, or is hostility towards these voluntary approaches a problem? Do we need a more regulatory approach?
Boy, you ask some really tough questions.
Yeah, these are tough questions. I'm just wondering what your sense of it is from being somebody who deals with these issues and interacts with people. What's your sense of people's responses to all these things?
So looking at this from an extension educator working with farmers, we have great response to the voluntary actions from farmers. They are more than interested in making changes and improving their operation and taking care of their water quality. And I would say that the really interesting part about it is that we've done some human dimensions surveys, right? Chris Chizinski's done some, we've done some in the Shell Creek watershed, and we find that we've got effectively third of our farmers are very concerned about their personal water quality. And the other 2/3 are kind of somewhere between, I've never thought about it, or yes, I'm concerned. But there's no one that says, no, this is not something I want to bring up. The other interesting one is that there's some pushback on some of the regulatory changes that get made at the local level. And I think that's something to be expected. All change will probably receive a little bit of pushback. But in broad generalities, I think producers are very willing to change. And what's been really very cool in the last 5 or 6 years, our commodity groups who are representing those producers have just become very interested in partnering with anyone and everyone they can to make those changes. So I actually think we're in a very positive place as a state where it comes collaborations, funding availability, people that are interested and willing to work together. So positive message for me. I mean, that on that front, completely positive.
Well, thank you for your optimistic scenario.
And did you have a second question in there? I didn't want to gloss over that. Did that?
Well, I do have a bigger picture question, which is, when I look at this, I have some hope for things like, what we're doing to the Gulf of Mexico. But how well does what you see at the state level, in the case of Nebraska, in your view, connect with those larger issues? And is there hope for those kinds of issues at that scale through this kind of approach? Or do we really need to think differently about those larger, it all ends up in the Mississippi and changes everything? Is there a different approach needed there?
I think the like if we think about Gulf hypoxia, that's actually been one of the things that, Nebraska is not part of the Gulf hypoxia task force, right? So the states that were part of that actually, or are part of that, they had some actions that they had to take, some plans that they had to put in place. Iowa State did some fabulous analysis that was funded on what putting in practices would do all across the state and what that would have for an effect. So they're actually probably, they're a few steps ahead of us because they had that regulatory kick in the pants that said, hey, you've got to make some changes or you have to do this analysis. Is there hope for that? I think that we're, if it's decades upon decades to create the problem, it's probably decades upon decades to fix the problem, except for the fact that there's a lot of people out there that are smarter than me that hopefully are going to make some better changes. On the ground changes make all of the improvements we need in water quality? I don't know that answer.
Thank you, Mom, for a great presentation. I'm Shabani Mula. I have a question concerning water quality in Nebraska, especially in Lincoln. How would you tell about the state of tap water that we're drinking in Lincoln? Most of international students, the first thing that we hear about Lincoln water is that nitrogen. So is it safe, or what would you tell international students about drinking tap water or just keep on purchasing bottled water?
Oh, Lincoln's water is completely safe. So anything that's supplied to you from a public water supply system like Lincoln, Omaha, any town, even a small community, they are required to test for nitrate and many other things. And if it does not meet that standard, then they have a whole litany of things that happen. So if it's coming to your tap, you are in good place in Lincoln.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is that water is a public trust doctrine. So why don't you monitor private wells or the private wells? Why does the government just enforce them and code it as we want to monitor your well? Maybe they are contributing much nitrate in the water body.
Well, we monitor private agricultural wells. So we do some of that, especially where we have high nitrate concentrations. We do not monitor private drinking water wells for individual houses. And a lot of that comes back to the costs associated with monitoring and not only collecting the samples, but also analyzing and results and the people to manage that data. So that is the what we do and don't do. Why we don't do that, there's actually a lot of interest in getting more data on private drinking wells. So we would like to get more information as a state, but we're probably not looking at monitoring individual drinking water wells.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question on Zoom. Maybe that'll be the last one, but thank you for your presentation. From conversations I've had, this is from Sarah Brock.
Oh.
Thank you for the presentation. From conversations I've had with well owners, the RO reimbursement application is a long and confusing process that has requirements that are challenging to accommodate, especially in rural areas. Are there options for these private well owners to get assistance in applying for these funds?
I'm going to look at Elbert, but I'm pretty involved in that. And the short answer is there is not assistance there's not funding assistance to help them go through the application process. There are a couple people that you can call at the NDEE that will help you walk through it, but it is complex.
Thanks. Dan Ross made a comment to the question regarding regulating private wells. It should be noted that Nebraska does regulate the construction of those wells, so they don't contribute anything to the aquifers.
Right. So in 1988, I think, is when we started having well standards. So anything constructed after that time frame, I'm getting a nod, so I feel good. Anything constructed after that meets our standards.
Okay, well, we're at 4:30, so maybe we'll just give Katie another round of applause and call it good.
Thank you.